Alright, so let's talk about my favorite topic, Bioshock Infinite. So there's several reasons I'm doing this reaction to Errant Signal's video on Bioshock Infinite. One, I really just want to get something out there to revive this dead YouTube channel. And two, in the years since I've talked about Bioshock Infinite, I've developed a lot, and I've discovered that I actually have a lot to say in response to Franklin's video. I still think in his analysis, Franklin is too harsh on the game, but I also think there's a couple points where I just outright disagree with what he says. So, let's watch it.
I give you all I got to give you. Take my tears and that's not really unchanging love.
I'm gonna say this up front. There's a lot to love in Bioshock Infinite. The game is one of the most jaw-droppingly gorgeous games in recent memory, thanks mostly to some deft art direction. It evokes a turn-of-the-century charm with an almost Norman...
Okay, so you can already see how much of a fan I am of Franklin's work from the outset here. If we go to my YouTube channel and the video I made years ago, I couldn't really figure out how to write an intro paragraph to my video about Infinite, so I pretty much just lifted this straight from Franklin. There's a lot to love in Bioshock Infinite. Its setting is gorgeous. There's a lot to love in Bioshock Infinite. Its setting is gorgeous with its city and sky in vibrant colors, and the story makes it incredibly interesting throughout, filled with twists and ideas. However, Bioshock Infinite's greatest... Like, I sound so terrible in this video, but you can see how much I am just directly ripping off of Franklin.
Rockwell sense of idealism. And the visuals are steeped in a three-pronged soundtrack that has original scores, licensed period music, and old-timey covers of pop songs from the last 50 years. It's hard not to be moved at some point during the game, either by jaw-droppingly gorgeous vistas or cleverly rearranged covers of a song. To top that off, there are moments of real, genuine human empathy here.
And like, Franklin's work is brilliant. If you aren't already watching the Errant Signal videos, please do so. There's some of the best game analysis on YouTube. In my opinion, just as straight up the best game analysis on YouTube.
These are emotionally charged scenes that feel like real things that real people would do. They're effective, grounded, honest. They give the game a much-needed sense of humanity because so much of the game is, well, this.
So it's interesting. There's a lot that's been said about the violence in Bioshock Infinite. I'll delve more into later when Franklin actually addresses it in more depth. But it's easy to feel a lot of tonal dissonance in Infinite's violence. You have this basically Disneyland-esque city that you're presented with all these beautiful colors and a quote-unquote idyllic life. But once the game actually starts, the gameplay actually starts, that is, it's filled with violence, this brutality that directly contrasts against it. And it's very easy to feel this as a tonal dissonance, this beautiful city with all this violence and corruption and brutality that you're introducing to it. You saw very, very early on when Bioshock Infinite first came out, Extra Credits made a video talking about this, how it is dissonant, that you're looting and that you're committing all this violence in this perfect city. But in more recent years, or not more recent years, years after this, we've had opposing viewpoints. In Dan Olson's Floating Ideas video on violence, one of the topics he introduces is how Infinite's violence tonally, how this tonal confliction with the violence is the point. How it's shown hypocrisy of Comstock and how it's presenting a failing society. And here we have a question to ask ourselves. Whether we believe the violence is tonally dissonant, or if tonal dissonance is the point, if so many people are making this mistake, if you believe it is a mistake, does that mean that the text failed to demonstrate its viewpoint, or are people just misinterpreting the text? And I personally don't really have a clear answer on this. Again, we have a critic I very much respect, Chris Franklin, saying that the violence is tonally dissonant. But then you have another a critic I respect almost as much, Dan Olson, praising its use of violence. And I personally don't really know how to reconcile these viewpoints. And I don't know if there is a way to reconcile these viewpoints. But it's just a question to ponder.
Be out of place in most games, but Bioshock Infinite doesn't want to be most games. It wants to be important. It wants to say something. But it thinks it can do that without addressing its absurd, stilted,
Okay, so here we have Franklin's response to Infinite. And if you notice throughout this video, Franklin does. He's a lot harsher on the game than he is on other games, which I'm going to try to point out as much as I can. The reason I'm doing this video is because I really wanted to talk about it when doing a rewatch of all of Franklin's work. And Franklin is a lot more into video game communication circles than I am, or at least he used to be at this time. So what I think he's doing, in why I think he's so much harsher on this game than he is on other games, and why I think he's so much harsher on this game than he needs to be when he's shown softer edges when discussing other games, is that he's responding to the circle of discourse that was around Bioshock Infinite at the time when it first came out. If he revisited the game today, I don't think he would be as harsh personally. In the circles, based off of this video, I believe Infinite was probably being praised for its story and for what it was trying to do, much like the original Bioshock was. It was being praised for trying to push the medium forward, for trying to be the Citizen Kane of video games. And it's not that. It's far from that. Bioshock Infinite, in my opinion, isn't a bad game, but it's not a great game. But in responding so much to the video game discourse, praising this game as a masterpiece, praising this game as the Citizen Kane of video games, Franklin's discourse is colored. He has to respond to that, and his expectations are set much higher, so the failure to meet those expectations causes him to be a lot more disappointed, and he has to be a lot more negative to emphasize his point. And that's probably the core takeaway to take of this video. While I generally agree with most of what Franklin says, I think it's spot on, he is way harsher than he needs to be, and the game is a lot better than he makes it seem.
It wants to say something, but it thinks it can do that without addressing its absurd, stilted, floaty, gory gameplay, and more than anything, that's why it fails. Sure, we could wax philosophical about the game's ending, but that's 20 minutes of barely interactive play made memorable by a plot twist. And
barely interactive doesn't inherently mean bad, though. There's a lot of really, really great games that have long periods of very little interactivity. But I do get his point. Actually, no, let's go into a side tangent here. I forgot my points. There's games back then, especially back then, but even right now, are a very underdeveloped medium. Games have been around for, 30 years? Other mediums, cinema has been around for, 100 to 200 years? Books have been around for who knows how long. And as a result, these mediums that we often compare games to, that games have to coexist alongside and compete against, are a lot more developed than video games. Film knows how to be a good film a lot more than games know how to be games. So oftentimes we see a lot of other media, or we see games when they're trying to be film actually perform a lot better than they often do as games. Bioshock Infinite is at its best in its cutscenes when it can just rely off of filmmaking and know what makes a good film. Because then that's explored territory. That's a lot easier to do than making a good game. It's why cinema, on average, tends to tell higher quality and more meaningful stories than games. And we saw this in Life is Strange as well. One of the reasons Life is Strange succeeded so much is because it was so heavy on cutscenes. It could rely on what makes good cinema, and its creators knew what good cinema was, and so they were able to make a highly successful game. Whereas Nintendo, one, isn't really trying to tell super meaningful stories, and Chew struggles a lot harder to do so because its designers have a, been a lot more deep into ludology. I forget what, but I think there's a quote of Miyamoto saying like pretty much dismissing stories in games and pretty much valuing mechanics. But it's completely slipping my mind at the moment. And but the point is, uh, Nintendo rejects cinema and works a lot in games, and as a result, they have a lot harder time telling your story and communicating meaning through games. But don't get me wrong, there are games that do a very good job of using their medium to tell their stories and really show the true potential of games. Things that come to mind are Papers, Please, especially, and everything, though everything is pretty avant garde. It's been 1 minute 40 seconds, and we're into the video, and we've been talking for 11 minutes, so I'll try not to interrupt quite so much.
While it is neat and it does have some of the best moments of the game, it doesn't justify the 7 hours that came before it any more than making people watch a good Twilight Zone episode can justify making them watch 7 hours of homemade snuff films. About a fifth of the game seems to stem from a place that at least has ambitions of being artful, of saying something that connects with people. But the remaining 80% is gunshots, explosions, and magical space booze that gives you colorful superpowers as you slaughter racist religious zealots in a city in the sky with your nine-fingered companion who can take...
Okay, so here's an important point that I actually want you to disagree with. It's minor, but it is still present in this intro section. Franklin brings up a lot of topics, and we'll get to them later as he goes more in depth on them. But here, Franklin's talking about all these mystical, magical, romantic properties of Infinite. How you have a magical companion who only has 9 fingers. How you have this city in the sky. And he's talking about how that's tonally dissonant with human connections, which is actually something I really heavily disagree with. Just because something's fantastical doesn't mean it can't be relatable. Just because, for example, I'm reading a story or watching anime that takes place in the Middle Ages doesn't mean that I, as someone who has never lived in the Middle Ages, can't relate to characters, can't experience emotional depth. It doesn't inherently make it tonally dissonant. As long as your story is well executed, as long as you're using your setting for a purpose, you can attach relatable elements and efficiently communicate your ideas.
...to alternate dimensions. You see how that might conflict with the grounded emotions and empathetic truths a little bit?
So no, I don't think it inherently conflicts unless you're doing your story poorly.
The game suffers from some severe dissonance between its play and its story, although that's certainly here. Booker will be mourning his time as a Pinkerton agent keeping the Unions down or lamenting his involvement in Wounded Knee 1 minute, and the next he's exploding the heads off of one person or jamming his skyhook straight into the neck of another. But more than just dissonant, the combat feels like empty, pointless filler designed to pad a game out to official
So, okay. You could talk about this section, Battle of Wounded Knee, as tonally dissonant. How you have DeWitt describing the terrors he committed at Wounded Knee in a somber tone, and then you commit relatively, no, though not quite to anywhere near the extreme terrors on the enemies you're facing. And you could definitely read it that way, and that's definitely a valid reading. But I also want to present an alternate reading, as the violence here is reflective of DeWitt as a character, how he's become complacent in the violence he's committing and accepted it as part of his life. It's what makes him a flawed individual and an interesting character. And the character arc of the game is DeWitt learning to take responsibility for his actions, take responsibility for Anna, and eventually sacrifice himself in order to prevent these violent atrocities. That's why Comstock is in the text. He's a foil for DeWitt, while also literally being DeWitt, and as a result, he's showing the hypocrisy in DeWitt's actions, how DeWitt is refusing to take responsibility by presenting someone who does the more or less the same actions as DeWitt, but does take responsibility for his actions. He knows he's committing violent atrocities, and he's content with it. But that doesn't say Franklin is wrong here. I think both readings are valid. It really just depends on the lens you're taking to the game and what you classify as the core themes of the game.
Game length TM. The violence is never at any point sufficiently justified. In Bioshock, splicers felt like monsters, but in a way they actually were. They were certainly no longer human and were driven mad either by their genetic modifications, living in a tin can at the bottom of the sea, or simply witnessing the horrors of Rapture's fall. Here, though, there's no justification for why everyday townsfolk will bum rush Booker with a suicidal fervor and insatiable bloodlust.
There is a justification here. This town, this city, is a literal extremist cult that's willing to do whatever Comstock says just at the name of it. There is a very important scene in the game where you're put in front of a giant movie projector of Comstock, and he tells them to kneel and to let you pass so you can see the projector. And you can actually kill these enemies during the scene. I don't know if Franklin will show it, but if he does, I'll point out. And you can just kill these enemies as they're kneeling in front of Comstock, and they just won't react. They're so ingrained in this ideology, in this cult, that they will let you murder their allies right in front of you and not raise a hand. And that's the point of the game. It's showing Comstock as this evil person, as this totalitarian, malevolent society that doesn't treat its individuals or citizens with any respect. And that's why they bum rush you. So it does make sense in context. I don't quite buy Franklin's argument that the diegesis just is inherently conflicting.
Rapture felt like a place where automatics were stalking you for their next fix. Bioshock Infinite feels like a game that puts enemies in your way because it's a video game, and that's what video games do.
But Comstock is literally placing enemies in your way.
Bioshock Infinite's equivalent of Big Daddies. It's even implied that they're based on Fink overhearing Shu Chong and Tenenbaum's research. In Bioshock, Big Daddies would roam the halls and warn you away if you got too close, but you had to actively transgress to start combat. These fights were, at least until the end of the game, major events that had you gather resources and plan for them. But when you were ready, you could attempt to slay one of these huge beasts, and when you killed him, he'd let out a tortured moan as his little sister would sob over the body. What happened to her then was up to you. Big Daddy fights had a sense of anticipation and player preparation leading up to them that climaxed in this. Fights had a sense of sob over the body.
Okay.
What happened?
So if there's one thing Franklin's really, really, really good at, it's ludology in FPS games. This is Franklin's area of expertise, and there are very few that can surpass him in this level of discussion. So when Franklin starts talking about ludology like this, like how the Big Daddies are just a better, more interesting enemy than the other characters, the other pseudobots that I can't remember the name of, then he's generally spot on, and there's not a lot I have to add to the conversation. But here, he frames the binary moral choice story of the Little Sisters as a positive, as an interesting mechanic. And yes, it is an interesting mechanic. It does add some depth that Infinite doesn't have, but it's also a really terrible binary moral choice system that isn't really deserving of praise. And that's just a minor caveat that I'm just going to throw out there.
Big Daddy fights had a sense of anticipation and player preparation leading up to them that climaxed in this combination of victory tinged with a bit of sadness. In Bioshock Infinite, handyman attacks are just scripted events that come whenever the designers think they'd look the coolest. A big guy in a metal suit shows up and wails on you like he's a stock mini-boss out of Double Dragon. There's no tension, just a war of attrition as you try to whittle his health down before moving on, indifferent to the whole affair. These monsters don't have a meaningful place in the world the way the Big Daddies did. Your fights with them don't have any emotional stakes the way your fights with Big Daddies did. The result just feels hollow and clumsy in comparison. They're just a particularly frustrating generic bad guy that prevents you from getting to another quiet conversation with Elizabeth or a small moment with a Colombian citizen. And that's to say nothing of the infinite spawning Ghost Mom boss, or the Protect the Generator level, or the giant scripted airship takedown, or the transparently scripted chase sequence leading up to the Comstock ship. In a very palpable way, Bioshock Infinite is far more contrived, gamey, and artificial than Bioshock ever was.
Okay, everything Franklin said there was spot on. These are extremely valid criticisms of Bioshock Infinite. However, what Franklin is missing is he's just completely omitting a lot of the positives to Infinite's ludology. The Bioshock had a lot more interesting gameplay system, but these gameplay systems didn't really fit the narrative all that well, or had you much invested in the narrative. Part of this is because Bioshock, despite its praise, really didn't have much of a narrative, and what was there wasn't that great. Like Bioshock Bioshock Original has a beginning where it sets up the world, then it has several hours of gameplay, and then it has an end with a plot twist. And that's pretty much the summation of the interesting parts of Bioshock's narrative. In contrast, Infinite is a lot more narrative focused. It has a lot more to do with its narrative, and it actually has it its ludology comment on its narrative in a lot of notable parts. What I'm going to say here is going to be repeating a lot in my Bioshock Infinite video, but you have some notable examples, such as Elizabeth throwing you medkits and health packs, or the one of the final levels of the game, Comstock's house, does the classic action video game thing of using stealth to communicate disempowerment. And these are very important and critical moments to the game that Franklin is just completely omitting in this section. Even though he does get to Elizabeth later, it needs to be included here. It needs to be included here because it needs to be a fair representation of both the positives and negatives of the game, rather than just only saying the negatives, saying the game is bad, and then hinting towards the positives, if that makes sense.
And that goes for the environmental design too. The entire game feels less like a trip to a city in the clouds and more like a trip to Walt Disney World. No small part of this is due to all of the turn-of-the-century Americana, but the sense
I mean, it is
of
literally trying to
way
reference
deeper than that.
Disney World.
The entire game is suffocatingly linear, and you'll find yourself wondering why a city of free-floating islands has only one path in and out of any given area, and whether men, women, and children all use skyhooks to get around. There are plenty of doors to nowhere and environmental design meant to funnel you down the intended path. Giant signs label Shantytown and the factory and the Hall of Heroes to announce that you're entering a differently themed area, the way signs might point out how you're entering Frontierland or Tomorrowland at Disney. You'll see crowded beaches and city streets one moment, and as soon as combat begins, they're curiously empty, as though Columbia also has the ability to transform itself into a gladiatorial arena at a moment's notice.
I mean, the pedestrians all run away from you during this point. And so, shortly after this, there's a moment where you enter what I believe is a restaurant, though it might be a house. I can't quite recall. And there are citizens there right before soldiers storm in. And these are citizens that react to you, that plead that you don't hurt them, that you can kill. And so I don't really understand this criticism here. And having a lot of citizens just wandering around in a game where it's already a bit difficult to recognize where all the enemies on a given map are isn't something that I really feel like the game needs. It doesn't need more visual clutter. And also, there's this core point of this in the extreme linearity of the game. The game is definitely linear. It's a lot more linear than the Bioshock 1 and 2. It's not quite as linear as like a Call of Duty or something. There are plenty of explorable options, and the exploration is pretty rewarding narratively. But it does feel extremely linear. But I don't really classify that as a terrible thing. I do like a lot of linear games. I play a lot of JRPGs, and those are extremely linear. And I don't quite get why this is such a damning point. If you want to include it as like a minor criticism, I get it, but Franklin hasn't sold me on that linearity is inherently bad, and he hasn't sold me why linearity would be inherently bad.
Experience is one of playing a first-person shooter themed after the Magic Kingdom's Main Street, USA. It's a gorgeous, lovingly crafted homage to turn-of-the-century small-town America, but it's also very obviously a scaled-down facade, and instead of emptying out for a parade, it empties out so you can throw fire grenades at people. Columbia may be beautiful, but it also feels hollow and artificial. But while the emotional tone of the game may be less...
And that artificiality is the point. It's why the violence contrasts so heavily against the society. It's why the racism at the beginning of the game sort of pops out of nowhere. in a very blatant uh, display during the baseball scene. Comstock has built what he calls an idyllic America. He's built what he calls a paradise, but it's all a facade. It's all just a facade to get his cult members into the cultish mentality, and it hides some very, very dark secrets that the society runs off of, and some stuff not so secret, like the racism. And as a result, I feel like that very much works to the game's benefit and the story it's trying to tell in its portrayal of Comstock.
Acting and the setting of Columbia may be flawed, it's the gameplay that ultimately tipped the scales against Bioshock Infinite for me. At this point, just about the entire soul of the game's legacy has been stripped away. You can play System Shock 2, Bioshock, and Bioshock 2, and chart how their Ultima Underworld influence is lessened as they've become more and more a stock shooter with every iteration.
This
With
is fair.
Bioshock Infinite, that transformation is more or less complete. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Human Revolution simplified or removed a lot of Deus Ex's mechanics, but it still felt true to the series, yet modern. But the
And this is weird. I think Franklin is a lot nicer on Human Revolution than he should be or needs to be. Human Revolution, like a lot of immersive sim fans, I'm not a big fan of Human Revolution. But it has a lot of the same problems. This oil and water approach to narrative storytelling, this stripped down mechanics, and just mechanics that aren't really that great in comparison to other things on market. But Franklin's able to praise Deus Ex Human Revolution as a good game, as a game he likes, where he's so damning on Infinite. He absolutely loathes Infinite. And this is a contrast of like the same problems between the games that I can't quite reconcile.
a lot of Deus Ex's mechanics, but it still felt true to the series, yet modern. But the mechanics they've settled on haven't transformed the game into a streamlined version of itself. Arguably, that's what the first Bioshock did when it modernized System Shock 2. Instead, they've taken a game franchise that has been
And here I want to pose the question: does Bioshock Infinite have to play like Bioshock 1 and 2? It the So Bioshock 1 and 2 are immersive sim uh, games about resource management more than they're about shooting, right? And whereas in contrast, Bioshock Infinite plays a lot more like a COD or Halo, where it's more so about shooting. But my question is that a bad thing? Why should we place such a precedence on this immersive sim gameplay compared to the road shooting? Besides the fact that the immersive sim genre is just a better genre. That was a joke. But the Franklin takes the inherent premise that transitioning to an FPS genre is inherently bad, which I'm not quite sold on. I'm not quite sold that Bioshock Infinite needs to play like Bioshock 1 and 2. I don't know why the designers decided to fundamentally change the core mechanics of the game, but I'm not sold that it's necessarily a bad concept inherently, even if they did mess up the execution to a degree.
traditionally about resource management and planning with an action twist, and boiled it completely down to a stock shooter. What little inventory management Bioshock had left is gone. Crafting is gone. Hacking is gone. Security systems are functionally gone and
Hacking was a terrible minigame, at least in Bioshock 1. Bioshock 2 did it better, but it was still annoying. Um, and resource management is gone, but that's because the game has shifted genres. I'm still not persuaded that shifting genres means inherent doom to failure. It's I'm not persuaded that's an inherent bad thing.
replaced with boring turrets and guns that attack on sight. Bioshock had three independent systems you could play against each other, like having a turret hit a Big Daddy to make him fight it, or throwing Enrage at a Big Daddy to kill splicers. None of that is here.
And like you could raise the question, like if you're just going to change the fundamental mechanics of Bioshock Infinite, why are you making a sequel? But if we're taking this premise of changing things means they're the rhetorical question is why have sequels at all? Because if you're not willing to change anything, then all you're really doing is just recreating the same game as old, and there's no point to that sequel. And if you're willing to change too much, then it separates the game from the series. But I'm not sold that that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not explaining this well. So the question, why have a sequel at all? There's a number of answers to this question. One, you have marketability. People like to see things from a development team they trust, and they like to see things from a world they trust. But a sequel doesn't necessarily have to be a new take on original concepts. There's remakes and reboots and sequels that change stuff significantly from the original and can still succeed. Lara Croft Tomb Raider in like I think the remake came out in 2013. It plays nothing like the original Lara Croft or the original Tomb Raiders, but it still succeeds as a much better game, and it still succeeds as a Tomb Raider game. Like it, no one's arguing that Lara Croft Tomb Raider, the Tomb Raider remakes, shouldn't be called Tomb Raider. And I think the same is true of Infinite. I don't think just because Infinite is different means it inherently failed as a Bioshock game. If the designers have a vision of the game that they want to tell, that of a linear FPS, then I want to see how that vision pulls through. And if I subjectively don't like the new version of the game compared to the old because I was already a fan of the old series, then that's fine. But that's not an objective criticism. That's not a damnation of the game. That's me deciding what I want to play this weekend.
The photography research minigame is completely absent.
That I also hated that minigame.
Mechanics have been replaced with a nonsensical clothing system where, depending on what kind of hat or vest you wear, your skyhook.
And here we have Franklin falling back on diegesis. Like, just because it doesn't make sense isn't a damnation of the game. Like, your shirt making you take less damage isn't really a core failing on the game's part. It's a minor plot hole that you can just dismiss easily. And I do like this system. This equipment system is the most depth the combat system has, the most RPG elements the combat system has. Because you get to do a lot of different play styles based off of your equipment. Like you can do entire Skyhook playthroughs if you have the right equipment, if you build yourself up the right way. So Franklin presents this system as negative, but I don't think this equipment system is actually bad. I like it.
Can set people on fire or give you health from kills. You no longer have multiple ammunition types for each weapon. Weapon upgrades are still here, but they've made the entire system broken and pointless by doubling the weapon count and then letting you only pick up at most 2 weapons at a time. This means you might spend
Sorry, we're going to rewind a bit.
People on fire or give you health from kills. You no longer have multiple ammunition types for each weapon.
Okay, so you no longer have multiple ammunition types for each weapon. That's not a bad thing. There's plenty of very good games that have universal ammunition systems, like Team Fortress 2. It's a design aesthetic that has some purposes, and it has pros and cons. And Franklin has talked about those pros and cons before if you watch his Deus Ex Invisible War review. But he doesn't actually address those pros and cons here. He just frames it as inherent negative and moves on. And this is what I mean when Franklin is being unnecessarily harsh on the game. He's not actually justifying his points in to reveal why the game is so terrible compared to other games on the market, other games he's talked about, so much worse than them. He just talks about the game's mechanics and says it in a really mean negative tone and acts as if that's a damnation of the game.
Upgrades are still here, but they've made the entire system broken and pointless by doubling the weapon count and then letting you only pick up at most 2 weapons at a time. This means you might...
Yeah, this is spot on. That whole limited weapon count upgrade system is kind of terrible. And Franklin's framing here. I'll finish this section and then I'll give my thoughts.
By doubling the weapon count and then letting you only pick up at most 2 weapons at a time. This means you might spend $1,000 upgrading a pistol that you might drop when you realize 2 other weapons are situationally more advantageous right now, but the only way you can get that upgraded pistol back is to find another one laying about in the world levels later. Exploration is all but dead.
Okay. So the upgrade system. The upgrade system in this game is terrible. Franklin is spot on. The you can only carry limited amount of weapons, and he frames it as um, an upgrade you get gets wasted because you have to drop it for another weapon that's more situational advantage. And this very much applies to the early game, but in the late game, you can only upgrade a limited amount of weapons, and in the late game, non-upgrade weapons become near useless. Upgrade weapons are really the only ones you can use. So rather than risk throwing away a weapon and picking up a non-upgrade weapon and being left with only that when you run out of ammo, what late game Bioshock Infinite actually tends to be is you just keep the two weapons that you have upgraded, and you just use those the entire game, regardless of the situation, which really kills the depth of the weapon system because the point of having limited weapons is to force you to switch out weapons. It's to force you to use the different tools in a variety of ways. You can't just use your shotgun the entire game because you like the shotgun. And this upgrade system inherently conflicts with that. So this point is spot on, even if it is important to note that it's the way he frames it applies to the early game, and it works differently in the late game.
Bioshock had plenty of nooks and crannies and back alleys to rifle through. Infinite occasionally gives you a closet. But more than the lack of space
It's a bit more than a closet. Franklin is being overly harsh here.
is to explore,
A
there's
fair bit more than a closet.
just not all that much to find. Bioshock had help kit.
Like I remember, I was doing a replay of Bioshock Infinite like a year ago. I was just replaying the beginning of the game for fun because I was bored, and there's this moment where you can find a safe. I think it's the 0451 safe through breaking into a house through like the sky. Like you break the glass in on the roof of the house, and then you can break into it. And I, as someone who had played Bioshock Infinite twice before, had no clue this was in the game. It was a completely optional building, and when I discovered that, that kind of blew my mind, which was really cool. So Franklin's being overly harsh here. It's not just a closet, but his point is still mostly accurate.
It's an Eve hypos to hoard, one-use weapon upgrade stations, tonics, crafting supplies, auto hack tools, and more. Infinite has boiled everything down to two core resources you can carry: money and lockpicks. Even the number of audio logs are cut in half from Bioshock, and there just really is no.
Yeah, but lockpicks are a very, very valuable thing that rewards a lot of exploration. And so they make the exploration worth it. And there are still audio logs. Like the narrative use of audio logs as increasing exploration is massive. They pretty much make exploration inherently rewarding. So I'm not sold about this negative either. Like, yes, maybe Bioshock Infinite doesn't have enough exploration or as much as one would like, but it does still have exploration, and it still does reward that exploration. And once again, I haven't been convinced that this linearity or this lack or this limited exploration is bad. Would the game have benefited if you had to walk down hallways that were four times the size and fight five enemies to get to each explorationable room to pad out the game without the core narrative appeal that is the game? Because here's why there's so little exploration in Infinite. Bioshock 1 and 2 were principally about their mechanics. They were about the reviving the immersive sim into a modern setting and making it palatable to console audiences. They were not games about their narrative. Their narratives weren't very good, even if Bioshock 2 did improve a lot narratively on Bioshock 1. So as a result, it had a lot of very wide open exploration sections because the exploration was the content. The exploration was the point of the game because the combat and the gameplay was the point of the game. You wanted to play more of it. You wanted more of the gameplay, so giving you more gameplay wasn't a bad thing. Whereas Bioshock Infinite is principally about its narrative. When you talk about what's so great about Bioshock Infinite, you don't go, "Oh, I really love the shooty bits." No, you talk about Elizabeth as a character. You talk about the narrative. And so you don't want players wasting time exploring hallways and exploring rooms that don't give them very much of the narrative that the game is about. You want them to feel like that they just are like one fight away from the next cool cutscene, the next cool character moment with Elizabeth, and that's the main appeal of the game. So the limited exploration is a nice detour, and it's a nice way to reward some exploration, give you that same sense of exploration that Bioshock has, but it does keep you. It makes sure that your train along the narrative doesn't stop, that you're not hitting the brakes. The limited exploration makes sure you're still playing the game at a reasonable pace and getting to the parts you want to.
Incentive to poke around the already linear, simplified levels. God, and this is just the stuff that's been removed. We haven't even gotten to how it actually plays yet. And, well, look, the combat in the Shock series has always been sort of bad, but that's okay, because it's always been backed by more interesting systems than how the guns feel in your hand. System Shock 1 and 2 were very much about resource management and rig building, and Bioshock tried to get you to play different factions of Rapture off of one another with traps and security hacks and plasmids. The fact that the gunplay was loose and flaccid never really mattered because that wasn't what the game was ever about at its core. But here, shooting is all that's left, yet it still feels like you're firing Nerf guns and pea shooters at unflinching bullets.
Okay, here's where I honestly get a bit confused. I don't have a lot of time in single player FPS games, not anywhere near as much as Franklin. But and I will fully agree that Bioshock 1 and 2 had really terrible game feel. But also Bioshock Infinite actually felt pretty good to me. Maybe some of the weapons were pretty flaccid, but like early in the game, you can one-shot headshot enemies with a pistol, and that's so satisfying. And like the sniper and shotgun are such amazing items to use in terms of game feel. Like just being able to land a headshot on someone from far away with the sniper and seeing their head explode as they get one shot, that is extremely satisfying. And the shotgun has such force in its animation and the amount of kickback you get from it that I subjectively I didn't have the same experiences playing that Franklin did in terms of game feel. And that's my input on this. I'm not saying Franklin is wrong, but I didn't share his personal experiences.
Sponges. The core gunplay was one of the original Bioshock's biggest criticisms, and it has not been improved here despite the increased.
I will straight disagree with that. It has been improved. It's better. It might not be good, but it is better.
Plasmids to get the enemies to play off of one another, bees and decoys for crowd control, and cyclones to let you set traps. Pretty much all vigors boil down to some combination of crowd control, direct damage, and trap, which means each vigor is effectively interchangeable. Each can be quite powerful, but that's the problem. Spamming
everything Franklin's saying here is spot on.
Control and damage amplifier isn't all that different than spamming Murder of Crows as a crowd control and damage amplifier. This doesn't take what Bioshock did and move it forward, it takes it way, way back. About the only vigor that has any unique utility is tossing people off of Columbia with Undertow. And if I'm being honest, it's too little too late after Dishonored's gust of wind power. That game was only 5 months ago, and it did the magical powers and gunplay things so much better than this. You get a sense of control.
Yeah, and everything Franklin said there is spot on. The core problem of Bioshock Infinite's gameplay is an overall lack of depth. It just feels like a point-and-click adventure game. You're just clicking on enemies' heads. And that's why I was praising the equipment system earlier, is because it's though, and why I was also praising the weapon switching mechanic, is because these are moments of the game that actually do have a lot of true depth. But once you get past the beginning of the game, once you get to late game, so let's say the second half of the game, you've more or less decided what equipment you like, and you're not making very many changes that often. And you have the weapons you like upgraded, so you're actively discouraged from swapping weapons, and you're directly incentivized to just keep using the same two weapons, because if you drop this weapon now, you might not get it back later. And as a result, you end up with a game that is just plain and clicking and has a severe lack of depth. So everything Franklin is saying here is completely spot on. And it's the core failing of Bioshock as a video game. More than any thematic conflicts, more than an oil and water approach to storytelling, this is what's damning, because the gameplay just isn't enjoyable, and it's unintentionally unenjoyable.
Controlling your environment, of planning your attacks, of having powers that genuinely have utility and play off of one another. Freezing time to set up multiple arrow shots in one instant, or tricking guards to run into a...
Okay, so what in this point Franklin is making when talking about the depth in the combat system, it's not a fair comparison because these games exist in different genres. Comparing Dishonored to Bioshock 1 and 2, absolutely fair. They're both immersive sims. Bioshock Infinite is not an immersive sim. It's a single-player FPS. It's much easier to compare it in terms of Half-Life. than to Dishonored. And here's where I look at the hypocrisy of how harsh Franklin is being. In his commentary, in both his video on Half Life and his commentary video on Half Life, responding to that original video, he says he liked Half Life. He says Half Life is a good game. But he's being so harsh on Infinite here, even though Half Life also lacks a lot of depth. And without the Vigor system, and without the weapon switching mechanics where you actually give up a weapon, Half Life arguably has less depth than Bioshock Infinite. I would certainly argue so. And as a result, I just don't see why Franklin is being so harsh on this game in particular. Or I do see it. I talked about at the beginning about how this is a response to journalism being overly praising the game. But I do believe Franklin is being unnecessarily harsh.
Springwire trap. I said in my Dishonored video that it created a ludic language to let players express themselves in, and if that's true, then Bioshock Infinite is a toddler's illegible scribblings. It's not a series of systems to let you plan and execute brilliant moves by
Yes, because Infinite is an immersive sim.
ways. It's simply a bedlam of spamming your favorite vigor and whatever two guns you happen to have. Quite frankly, it plays like a generic, derivative, unfinished, compromised mess, and I'm astounded that people can spend 7 hours shooting the same 4 enemy types with the same generic, ineffectual guns and utterly uncreative plasmids, and then hail the game a triumph. I've mentioned this before, but the modern shooter has a problem with health mechanics. Way back in the days of Doom, getting hurt was a sign.
Pay attention to what Franklin's saying here. This is a core part of single-player FPS analysis, and it's really, really good. Franklin knows his FPS games.
The player screwed up. Most of Doom's damage was dealt with avoidable projectiles or melee hits from monsters themselves. Completing a level was an act of balancing the amount you screwed up with the amount of spare health kits in the level, and easier levels and easier difficulties had more health kits. As the genre's matured, though, we've moved away from projectile avoidance towards systems where most enemies have hit-scan weapons that instantly go from the enemies to the player. This is ostensibly due to the trend away from magical imps with fireballs and towards more realistic weapons like machine guns and pistols. This represents a problem for the player, though. Now that you can't avoid bullets, you will get hit. It's not a sign that you've screwed up, it's an inevitability of moving around when there's an enemy nearby with instant hit guns.
And it's so weird because Half-Life has the same problem. But Half-Life also has a more or less permanent health system. And so it arguably more so has this problem than Infinite does with its shield mechanics. And yet Franklin just leaves this uncommented upon. He's so much nicer to Half-Life than he is to Infinite, even though they're existing in the same genre. And I'm just going to flat out say this. Bioshock Infinite is way better than Half-Life ever was.
So designers have taken to addressing this in a lot of different ways. Halo's approach was pretty successful. Players have strong shields that, when finally broken, cut away at core health, and only then are they in trouble. A few stray bullets hitting your shield doesn't mean anything permanent or dangerous. This allows you to move about and position yourself before attacking without constantly resource monitoring your health. Dishonored had long, telegraphed animations to let you know when bullets were coming to give you a chance of teleporting out of the way or using health kits. Call of Duty has a full-on health regen system where players can get hit as much as they wanted as long as they hunkered down and took cover before reaching absolutely zero health. And Gears of War combines that with a cover system to let you avoid most fire and control when you're exposed. Finally, the original Bioshock continued the tradition set forth in System Shock 2. Death isn't permanent and simply costs resources. Meanwhile, you can carry health kits to help you stave off death, but they're rare and also cost resources, so you need to use them wisely. So with this myriad of combat options available as precedent, and arguably plenty more mechanics waiting to be discovered, I'm aghast as to why Irrational chose an incredibly awkward merger of Halo shields, Doom item pickups, and a dice roll. They've adopted Halo's shield system, but part of what made that so successful was, again, that it was a strong shield, so that you had to screw up pretty bad to start taking damage against core health. Here, in order to balance and feed their upgrade system, it starts as a tiny sliver of overall health, making it effectively worthless until it's been substantially upgraded. And unlike the rest of the Shock series, you can't carry health kits with you anymore. You have to scavenge for them in the middle of combat as you need them, just like in Doom.
Okay. So, let's break this down. We have the shield system, and Franklin's main complaint is that the shield system is too weak to really feel good, to really play like Halo, where losing your shield is a sign that you messed up. And this is very spot on. Franklin is right here. But this only applies to the very, very beginning of the game. If you're playing Bioshock Infinite correctly, if you're playing it smart, you should send every upgrade you get to your shield until you max it out, because the shield is the most useful upgrade in game, and it's really what feels best, because it actually gives you that leeway. You really have to mess up to let it break by the time you fully upgraded it. And especially if you have the DLC where you get like 3 extra upgrades at the once in the room where you get the shield. If you just upgrade your shield constantly, it actually starts off pretty strong and feeling pretty good. But the fact that you have to know how the game works, and the fact that you have to choose one specific upgrade option of 3 and just constantly spam that one upgrade option, is a complete failure on the game's part. The game does not communicate that this is the correct way to do it to you in the slightest, and as a result, the shield system fails. So Franklin is right here. But if you do ever play Infinite, just focus on upgrading your shield. That is what will make the game so much more fun to play.
Except that works far better in Doom because, well, A, you can avoid most damage as they're projectiles instead of hit-scan weapons, and B, you just walk right over the health and ammo to pick them up. In Bioshock Infinite, you actually have to look right at them and then hit a use key to pick them up. The result is that combat in Bioshock Infinite has players running around trying to scavenge resources in the middle of battle from bodies and drawers, while getting hit with damage they can't meaningfully avoid.
Okay, but here's the thing. Yes, there are health kits on the ground that you can pick up, but outside of the early game, they appear less and less frequent. They're a much smaller part of the game's mechanics, because the core way to regain health isn't actually to grab health kits off the ground. It's to have Elizabeth throw you the health kit and save you, so that you become more attached to her as a character ludologically, and so the game's looter narrative actually works successfully. This is why right here, if we watch Franklin,
From bodies and drawers while getting hit with damage.
You're not scavenging medical kits off the ground here. You're using Elizabeth's powers to create some medical kits that you can then use yourself. And what this does is, if you find medical kits on the floor, that's the world helping you. But if you use Elizabeth's powers to create some medical kits, that's her helping you. And that succeeds far more than just being able to walk around med kits and picking them up. It really lets you become attached to Elizabeth. And so I would argue that's actually a success about the game.
They can't meaningfully avoid. These look at something and interact with it.
And Franklin does bring this up.
Have their roots as far back as System Shock and Ultima Underworld, but they have no purpose being mechanics you'd want players to absolutely rely on in the middle of combat. Ultimately, I found myself running out of health and not being sure I could survive the run to the closest health pickup, because hit-scan weapons would tear through my mediocre shield and kill me, and even if I got to the health kit, I'd have to scramble to align my mouse cursor with the thing and hit the use key. And in the middle of all of that, they throw Elizabeth. I've played through the game twice, and it's still not exactly clear to me whether she tosses the player actual items that could otherwise be picked up in the game, or if she just randomly generates health ammo and salts all on her own.
I'm fairly confident she just generates them on her own, but I haven't looked at the wikis. I don't actually know.
Either way, though, the impact of the player is the same. In place of a reliable pool of health kits or salts like in Bioshock, you'll randomly get thrown a lifeline by your companion. And I get why they did it. It's an attempt to develop a relationship between Elizabeth and the player, and it's actually rather effective when she manages to give you what you need right as you need it.
This is why they have the systems in the way they do. This is why you can't just pick a medkit off the ground. The entire point is to make you dependent on Elizabeth, to get you attached to the character, and that's arguably one of the greatest strengths of the game. Mechanically, Elizabeth is a lot more involved in gameplay than The Last of Us' Ellie, and that's why whenever I play, I get so much more attached to Elizabeth than I do Ellie in The Last of Us. Elizabeth actually feels like she's actually helping you and pushing you forward throughout the game, and when she's gone, you really feel it. Whereas in The Last of Us, Ellie's just kind of there. You don't really feel her presence mechanically. She just kind of feeds you voice lines. And I think, as a result, Franklin is taking this massive positive of the game, something Infinite does better than almost better than any other game I've seen, and just really tones down how cool the mechanic is and almost treats it as a negative.
Took away your health and salt inventories because they needed to make you dependent on her in order to make her feel like a legitimate partner instead of a burden. I get it. But it also means that when you're under fire with a sliver of health left and no idea which way to run, you're entirely reliant on a random number generator to save you.
And I don't think it actually is a random number generator. I think based off of my subjective experience of Infinite, this might not be accurate. But I think whenever you run low on a certain resource, she's programmed to just throw the resource to you. You run low on ammo, she throws you ammo. You run low on health, she throws you a medkit. And she's just programmed to not do this too often, to just nullify the difficulty of the game. So I think it actually is fairly consistent. She gives you a sort of safety net that you can use to an extent, but if you fall too hard, the safety net crushes. If you weather way too much at the safety net, it eventually snaps after catching you too many times. And so I think it is fairly consistent in that regard, and better play will lead to the game functioning as intended, in which she just throws you stuff every now and then, and you're able to use that to scrape by. So I don't think it's quite as random, and I don't think it feels quite as unfair as Franklin is making it out to be.
Player disenfranchisement is really bothersome for a game that's.
And actually, while we're talking about resources and Elizabeth throwing you stuff, I think something Franklin really neglects is the way you can almost soft lock yourself in this game, because it's a really awful part of this game. Sometimes you'll just end up in a place where you enter a really hard fight at higher difficulties, and you just run out of ammo. This is especially prevalent during the Ghost Mother sections, where there are infinite respawning enemies, so it's really easy to run out of ammo if you can't deal enough damage in time. And there's only so much ammo in a level, and there's not vending machines in every room. And so because the game doesn't allow you to backtrack, and because the game auto-saves you in certain encounters, or it doesn't auto-save, but it revives you with limited ammo and respawns the enemies. And as a result, it's very easy to soft lock yourself and just end up in a situation where you have to lower the difficulty to just progress. You just keep dying over and over and over, and not because you're playing any worse than you were before, but just because you've ran out of resources and you can't progress. And I think that's a really awful part of the game's design. That's a result of the mechanics, and I think Franklin just doesn't address it, which makes sense. Like, this is a broad overview of Bioshock Infinite. It's not going to address every single success and failing on the game, but I did want to talk about it.
Undeniably trying to be more combat focused and less interested in quirky mechanical twists about emotions. It's especially annoying because there had to be ways of setting up this sense of dependence on Elizabeth that were less reliant on Booker shooting people in the face and hoping she throws him a health kit, and more reliant on Booker being dependent on Elizabeth's superpowers. Entire games can and have been made using universe-switching mechanics. It dovetails nicely into the game's story and makes Elizabeth even more cool and powerful. It could open up puzzles or stealth mechanics that might give the game some desperately needed mechanical variety. But instead we have this giant and monotonous murder fest with poorly designed and sloppy-feeling derivative mechanics trying to pass itself off as meaningful because of a 20-minute ending cutscene and...
And do you see what I mean when I say Franklin is so harsh on this game? He just said, like, the lack of depth in the universe mechanics, how they possibly could have done more in the game, makes the game completely worthless, and it's only saved by a 20-minute ending cutscene. And this is obviously a jerk response to the reading he's been doing, where critics are praising the ending cutscene, praising the story. And it just leads to being so much more harsh on the game than it needs to be. And let's actually dig into this topic of the depth and universe switching mechanic. Not even switching mechanic, you know what I'm talking about. The Elizabeth's like making things pop out of thin air thing. It probably could have had a lot more depth. Like, imagine if you could like time travel into different environments as a result of her powers at will. or if you just really did anything else, anything more in depth or anything more crazy or wild. It probably would have helped the game a lot mechanically, actually. But you do run into the danger if you do it too much of just making the game have no mechanical identity and feeling like a bunch of random disconnected connected mini games that don't really have the depth or polish that they need to. Like Half Life does. Half Life 2 does. Half Life has the same problem as Infinite. Half Life 1 has the same problem as Infinite, where it's just the same point clicking shooting throughout the entire game. So yeah, he is right. They could have done a lot more with Elizabeth's superpowers than they did.
As long as we're on the subject of meaning, the game makes the same mistake that Bioshock did. It thinks that by presenting an idea, it's commenting on or engaging with that idea. It's sort of like saying that Errant Signal is a show about brackets because the damn things show up in every episode. Despite often referencing it, Bioshock had little to nothing to meaningfully say about objectivism. It was window dressing for the shooting and the big twist. And the pattern repeats here. Concepts of American exceptionalism, racial segregation, economic inequity, religious zealotry, and more don't really get discussed so much as simply displayed. Oh, their iconography is brought up when...
Okay, and what Figlin here is saying is spot on. There's, he's making the argument that Bioshock Infinite deals with a lot of themes, but it doesn't actually have much to say about those themes. It isn't engaging with them in any meaningful depth. It isn't adding anything new to the conversation. It isn't giving you any viewpoints that you wouldn't have otherwise had. And this is all very, very spot on. Infinite presents these ideas in interesting ways. I talked earlier about how the society of violence and comps actions are presented as a cultish atmosphere and contrasted against the harsh, violent underbelly that it's desperately trying to hide. And that is an interesting presentation, but that doesn't change the fact that the text has nothing to say about totalitarian authority or religion or cultish mentalities. But the problem I have with this argument is that it also applies to the vast majority of AAA games. Like, we had the Deus Ex illusion earlier. Deus Ex Human Revolution doesn't have a lot to say about its themes, and a lot of ink has been spilled about this, including by Franklin himself. Later on, after this, he'll make an entire video about why Mankind Divided can't effectively communicate its themes and how it has nothing to say. But he's so much harsher on Infinite than he is on Human Revolution for this point. And like I always say, that's my core frustration with this video. And by the way, if you do want to find a text that actually has things to say about subject matter, actually no, let's be more specific. Infinite deals with the topic of slavery, but it doesn't actually have anything to say about slavery. But if you do want a text that does have interesting themes to communicate about the subject, while still doing an upbeat tone and not trying to be like Frederick Douglass or something, there's an anime airing this season. Watch the first episode of Sugar Apple Fairy Tale, because you wouldn't expect it off of its cutesy imagery, but the main character, this girl right here, buys the character in the background as a slave, and it actually has it's an anime, it's a fantasy anime that talks about slavery from the perspective of the white man. It shows you how it's super easy to fall, not super easy, it shows you how people back then fell into the mindset of dehumanizing slaves and of abusing power. This is a character who believes that her fairy slave should be treated as a person, but she's pressured into ordering the slave to do stuff against their will and treating her slave as a slave. And that's a novel perspective. You don't see that very often in media, and you especially don't see it very often in anime. Just look at how terribly Shield Hero demonstrated its approach to slavery. And so I want to create this point of contrast on the subject, whereas Sugar Apple Fairy Tale does have things it wants to say about its subject matter, whereas Infinite just doesn't. And you should also watch Sugar Apple Fairy Tale.
But it's mostly just to use it as a plot beat. And in a way, that makes it all the worse. The game takes something as big and complex and serious as institutionalized racism, and instead of talking about its root causes or its human costs or the struggle to change hearts and minds and laws, it basically just uses it as a shorthand for, these white folks sure are evil. If the game attempts to take any political opinion at all, it's a milquetoast centrism that borders on nihilism by making both sides of the Colombian Revolution morally repugnant.
When it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell it.
But even to do that, the game tries to make some rather creepy false equivalencies between setting up a systemically racist government that persecutes other religions and being an overzealous revolutionary that takes things a little too far. It rings false and is honestly a little emotionally manipulative, placing the life of a child right in front of you in direct comparison to the myriad of abstract, unseen crimes and suffering at the hands of Comstock. The result is a game that embarrasses itself in its attempts to offend no one, asking only that you find a political position somewhere left of racist dictator and somewhere right of murderous revolutionary. And none of that matters anyway, as it drops what little political pretext it has in the rush to get to the exposition necessary for the ending.
And this is all spot on. But it's also a video he made years later about Far Cry. I think it was Far Cry 5. And that has the exact same problems, but Franklin is so much nicer on Far Cry 5 than this.
The ending. I'm not going to go through the trouble of trying to work out what happened. There are plenty of videos and forum posts where the actual logistics are being torn apart. What confuses me about the ending isn't literally what happened, but what those events are supposed to mean, what we're supposed to take away from them, if anything. I've got my theories, none of which are particularly flattering to the game, but this video's run too long already. I'll close by saying this. As much as I hated, and I mean really detested, Bioshock Infinite's core gameplay,
And here's him explicitly saying it. He says he hated Bioshock Infinite. Not just it underperformed, not just I had higher expectations. He loathed this game,
It was awkward conversations with Elizabeth,
which I just don't understand.
It was a father screaming out in defense of his child. It was a girl experiencing freedom and dance for once in her life. These are moments I legitimately loved in this game, moments that will stick with me. But we can't let games be human and artful in bits and pieces. Honesty and integrity and empathy aren't like marshmallows and Lucky Charms. They're not meant to be the small good parts.
And God, I love this image. This single image right here, this oil and water approach, or this oil and water lens to video games, is so gorgeous. It is the fundamental lens I apply to all my readings of video games. And it's really something AAA video games, or all video games, still struggle with to this day. Trying to figure out how to reconcile ludology and narratology, and how to meld them into one. But that's an entirely different topic for us to get into. And what Franklin's saying here is spot on.
Gunfire and murder. And they're not like the lollipop we get for being a good kid at the dentist. They're not the sweet reward we get at the end for putting up with all this tacky combat. They're things we need to be demanding our games simply be. Sneaking in a quiet moment or saccharine song between meaningless violence isn't going to push this medium forward, and no number of 10 out of 10 reviews is going to change that. Bioshock Infinite's ambitions to be an affecting game...
People are giving this game a 10 out of 10? Huh.
...core to its gameplay. Instead, we simply glimpse them between the cracks of the edifice, the way the Fink brothers overheard brilliance through the Lutece tears. And much like a jazz band cover of a Tears for Fears song, it's an imitation that strives for success it doesn't understand nor rightfully deserve.
I can stand this indecision, married with a lack of vision.
Right.
Everybody wants
That was my discussion of Chris Franklin's discussion of Bioshock Infinite. And I hope that was informative, or at the very least interesting. I didn't really have all that much I want to say. This ended up as pretty repetitive. But I did have enough that I want to say that I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to respond. If nothing more than it was just a fun activity to do. So, farewell.